All right, hello there, APE students. This is the review for Unit 2. It's split up into 6 parts. Part 1 is on energy and matter. Part 2 is going to take that further and look more specifically at each of the cycles for matter. Part 3 is about biomes. Part 4 will be species interactions. Part 5, population dynamics. And Part 6, water communities. So again, Part 1, energy flows and matter cycles. There are 3 factors that sustain life on Earth. It's the one-way flow of high-quality energy beginning with the sun. So again, energy flows. The important thing to remember here is that you cannot recycle energy. It flows in one direction, and every change it makes, it gets to be less quality. And so again, it is a one-way flow, cannot be recycled. Number 2, however, is that matter is cycled, and that's because matter cannot be created or destroyed. Same law applies to energy. Can't be created or destroyed, but we know that it changes in its quality. So number 2, cycling of matter and nutrients. It is a necessity because we have a limited amount of matter. And then the third thing is gravity. Gravity helps these cycles to function, these cycles to run. Energy changes are governed by the 2 laws of thermodynamics. Again, the first law says energy cannot be created or destroyed. Whatever comes into the system has to be the same amount that goes out of the system. But again, it can change along the way, and that's the second law of thermodynamics. Energy goes from a more useful to a yet less useful form when it changes from one form to another. We talked about high quality energy and low quality energy. So that's, again, dictated by the second law of thermodynamics. Here we see that in a picture. We've got the highest quality energy coming from the sun. The sun then transmits that energy into the plants through the process of photosynthesis. Then we get chemical energy coming out in the form of food. And finally, mechanical energy coming out. It's going to be our ability to work, to move, to think, to breathe. And those are all places along the way where we might waste heat. So we see this process going on. Every cellular function is going to take a little bit of that energy, and it's going to use it, waste it up, and it gives it off as heat or another byproduct similar, that it would be an energy source. We also talked about there are biotic and abiotic factors in nature. So this is a quick picture of an ecosystem. We know that there are living things in the picture. We've got a tree, we've got a rabbit, we've got decomposers, bacteria, you've got the fox. You also have non-living components, and those are equally as important. You have to have the oxygen, you have to have the water in the form of groundwater, in the form of precipitation. You've got to have minerals for the plant to take up that it can pass on to the consumers. And so again, we've got lots of living or once living, biotic, and non-living, never living, abiotic. Speaking about some of those parts of our ecosystem that are living, we also talked in this section about food chains. And what we should have learned is that the most important parts to our food chain are the producers, which are again taking that energy from the sun and converting it into a more useful form in the form of sugars, chemical energy that we can eat. Got to have your producers to change the energy, but you got to also have your detritivores and decomposers to turn the matter around and cycle it back. And so detritivores, detritus feeders, decomposers, they are incredibly important. Difference between the two: detritus feeders have a mouth, they can chomp down on their food. Decomposers absorb the food through their cells, through their tissues. So we've got fungus, we've got bacteria, those are in the decomposer section, whereas insects are going to be detritus feeders. This is very different, though, than a scavenger. A scavenger is a type of consumer. Okay, so these are detritivores. They're helping to break down. That's the key difference between a detritivore and a scavenger. The detritivore is breaking it down into very simple pieces that will be able to be recycled back to nature. A scavenger doesn't break it down that much. So here we see an ecosystem in its cycle, and what we should notice is that this solar energy coming into the cycle, that's the highest quality. The producers take that and they will convert it into a food source that can be passed on either to the consumers or straight to the decomposers. This is why we say that consumers are not a necessary part of the ecosystem. We can pass them completely and go straight from producers to decomposers and take all of that matter and cycle it back again. And you've got, again, you see up there is the chemicals, the carbon dioxide, the oxygen, the nitrogen, the minerals like calcium and phosphorus and those things that we've learned about sulfur. And a little bit of this heat is getting lost along the way. But again, it's still in the system, it's still in the earth, it's just getting to be a less quality energy. So solar energy, very, very high quality, heat energy, very low quality. Here's our food chain, and what we see here is a lot of terminology you should be familiar with. Again, we're really talking about transfers here of energy. So the solar energy goes to the plants. Photosynthesis makes it into food, which is then consumed by the primary consumer. Another word for primary consumer is a herbivore. It has to eat the plants. The herbivore's energy is then taken up by the secondary consumer, which is a carnivore. It could be an omnivore, but it's eating, in this instance, another animal, so it is a carnivore. And then you have your top predator, your top carnivore tertiary consumer, which is going to eat that bluebird. And so again, every step we lose a little bit in the heat transfer process. And the other thing you need to be familiar with is the terms for trophic levels. We start with the very first organism. So the plants are the first trophic level. The caterpillar is the second trophic level, and so on. But if you look right beneath that, the second trophic level is the first eater, so it is the primary consumer. Again, to point out that you don't have to have any of these consumers because the plants could pass by and go completely to the decomposers, and any of these chains could be broken along our links in our food chain whenever that animal dies. Energy flow, when we look at the pyramid of energy flow, what you need to remember is that only 10% gets passed on. So we're losing a zero every time with our energy steps. That means that 90% is lost. Make sure you read questions carefully to see if they're asking you about passed on or amount lost. Okay, so again, every time we go up in trophic levels, we are also then going to go down by we're going to only pass along 10%. When we're talking about energy, what we ultimately are concerned with is the energy that's getting passed along to our food chain, because we are going to be self-centered in that way. We want to be able to survive, and we want the things below us in the food chain to survive. And so a great measure of that photosynthesis ability is called a net primary productivity, NPP. Anytime you hear NPP, think photosynthesis. And this is a listing out of biomes and other life zones, like aquatic life zones, and how they stack up in comparison to their NPPs. We see that the swamps, marshes, and tropical rainforest are tied for the terrestrial ecosystem top spot, then temperate forest, and down the line. It really is very easy to think about. Just picture yourself in that place and ask yourself, how many plants am I surrounded by? If you're in a swamp or a marsh, you've got algae, you've got trees, you've got just tons and tons of things, a lot of algae though. Tropical rainforest, you've got plants, high canopy plants and low, you've got the understory. So again, you're surrounded by lots of plants. Estuaries, down for aquatic ecosystems. Estuaries are the ones that might have the mangroves. This would be like our coastal marshes. So those estuaries are the place where we get the most productivity in an aquatic system. We also discussed in this chapter, this is chapter 2 information, positive and negative feedback loops. When we talked about systems and inputs and outputs, what's going on? With a positive feedback loop, you change in the same direction. So when you decrease vegetation, it increases erosion, increases runoff, reduces nutrients in the soil, which decreases vegetation, and it continues to spiral out of control. So a positive feedback loop does not mean it's a good thing. It means it goes in the same direction. However, a negative feedback loop changes the direction you're going Thermostat in your house is a great example. When your house cools down and is too cold in the winter, it turns your furnace on. So your thermostat is there to regulate and keep things in balance. And a good way to think about negative feedback loop, remember the other term is corrective feedback loop. This maintains equilibrium. This maintains homeostasis. So our body has a lot of built-in negative feedback loops. And we saw the picture of the dog, talked about dogs pant, and that the process that we go through when we sweat. All of those things are designed to bring our body temperatures back down. And so to correct the problem, we change the direction of, in this case, temperature. And for biogeochemical cycles, that'll be part 2 here in a moment. Remember that what we mean when we say that is not a big scary word. There are living parts of the systems. There are earth parts to the system, especially talking about soil, talking about volcanoes and rocks. So it is a biogeo, and then the chemical is, again, those elements that we're discussing. So biogeochemical cycles. We've got water, we've got carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur. We're going to look at those again in more depth in part 2.